Deleted Session, April 20, 1981. Now, even as a young person, Ruber was the type of person who was considered out of place, rebellious, or even slightly dangerous in any Roman Catholic congregation, particularly in the time of his own youth. He took the dictates of the church seriously, but questioned them with as much passion and enthusiasm as he overall used in his affiliation with the entire church organization. The church did not like that kind of questioning, and in a fashion, it has always been highly suspicious of those who were too mystically inclined, for such people in their originality are not easy to lead. When Ruber was a church member, however, the church itself was there, easily identified. To some extent later, even when it was a wealthy opponent, Ruber could see where his own ideas fit in or did not. There was only so much leeway granted, so much questioning allowed, for beyond a certain point, of course, the entire dogmatic structure would fall apart. Most people were too emotionally dependent upon the entire organization to let it go. By the time Ruber left the church, he thought that it had also lost its emotional pull upon him. He felt free, and he immediately left toward what you can generally think of as the scientific viewpoint. Many other people were making that same leap at that time in your society. He was far from any scientist, of course. He did poorly in science in college, for that matter, for if his mind was too scientific for religious dogma, it was too creative and emotional for conventional scientific thought. Even later, as he began writing science fiction, that writing fell under the then less envious label of science fantasy, which was not considered as pure in science fiction circles. The sinful self shows itself in a period of transition from its religious to scientific format in science fiction or fantasy in particular, where you can almost trace the translation of religion's self, tainted by original sin, to the Darwinian and Freudian concepts of the flawed self, bound to destruction one way or another, propelled by the unbridled unconscious or evolutionary defect. Vanderbray's stories, for example, actually tells of a religious moralist. When you fear that man will most certainly destroy himself through his misuse of technologies, then you are expressing the same feeling in different form expressed by the religious attitude. Only religion's devils are turned into technological devices. So Ruber's belief in the sinful self went underground in those years. The creative abilities must revolve largely about man's definition of himself, his source and purpose, and all of your Western literature and art has revolved about the concept of the sinful self in one way or another. The Shakespearean plays are an excellent case in point, even when they concern even older heritages. So the creative artist in any field has certain creative traditions that become classic models for his art and that of the world. The use of the Frankenstein monster and so forth in television dramas, and the merging of strong destructive tendencies intermixed with the psychic abilities in current psychic horror stories, shows again the potent mixture of religion's sinful self and the science's flawed self. To some extent, though in a different fashion, both fear the emergence of new knowledge, since new knowledge is apt to upset either framework entirely. Science, of course, insists it searches for such knowledge, while at the same time narrowing its acceptable field of definitions. so that it effectively blocks any information that does not agree with its own precepts. Both science and religion, generally speaking, provide certain services, which again, generally speaking, can be withheld to those who rebel against such authorities. The Church can excommunicate you. Science, in its position of authority, can mark those who disagree with it. Ruber's basic beliefs of the sinful self were formed in childhood, individually interpreted through his own experience, given strong emotional validity, in other words, and emotional charge. The Church was not a hypothetical entity, but was encountered through Ruber's experience with the priests who visited, their effect upon his life and his poetry, and with the entire fabric of a young intense daily life. If the Church became upset with what Ruber wrote or read, then Father Ryan burned one of his books, or argued with his poetry, for example. So all of that was leaving emotional content. Ruber's creative abilities still had those classical models, yet because of his mind's originality and his natural intuitive nature, those creative abilities were also fueled by unofficial information. He was always to some extent in strong connection with the knowledge possessed by his nature person, and that knowledge kept seeking expression. Its expression directly contradicted first religious then scientific precepts. It kept seeking a larger framework for its own fulfillment and expression, of course, and at the same time it seemed to Ruber it brought about further decision. It made him more of a rebel. It took some time before such a framework began to develop, a kind of double one, represented by my work and by his own, an excellent accomplishment, of course, also an accomplishment that clearly stood out as a direct challenge to religion and science, that not only contradicted their theories, but offered an alternate framework through which reality could be experienced. Through the last few years, religious fundamentalism has begun to grow, bringing to the forefront in exaggerated form many of the old beliefs with which Ruber thought he had dispensed so neatly. Science, if it bothered, might label him a fool, but fundamental religion could label him as evil, or claim his work was inspired by the devil in Christian terms, and so the old beliefs in the sinful self or evil self were activated. They had always been present, of course. He did not admit those feelings, however. They were pushed back further and further. They seemed especially humiliating in the light of what he thought his public position should be. They inspired all the doubts. I want it understood that those feelings, nevertheless, were often used as creative propellants. The other materialistically given on the sinful self should be kept in mind along with this station. The term morality is a poor one, yet in the simplest of terms, men are born with the knowledge of their own basic goodness. So in the simplest of terms, they seek good actions. It is when dogmas distort the natural goodness that trouble develops. It is not natural to feel you exist in a sinful state. Religion, having in certain terms created the entire concept, had then to create the idea of redemption. To rectify it, Ruber has not been able to utilize the natural grace of the basic self because of those beliefs in their sinful nature. Those feelings were the ones that he experienced this morning. The fear that the self's very expression was somehow wrong, since the self itself was intrinsically flawed. your own lovemaking the other evening, and your renewed expressions of affection helped initiate the entire experience by letting Robert feel safe enough to be aware of and experience those sensations. Of course, they reflect upon the body, they seek expression. It is not that they are so fearful in themselves, but the effort to repress them gives them additional charge. Of course, the experience represents an important point of progress, as do the dream intentions. The release of those feelings will clear the air in all areas, allowing the insights of the natural person new freedom so that new needed information at all levels can flow into his experience. I want to emphasize again the poor reputation held by both science and religion concerning unofficial knowledge, an attitude clearly put forth in many tales and legends, from Adam and Evil to Pandora's box to the Frankenstein monsters. Robert felt he was someone who was bound to have access to such information. You did extremely well in helping him with the day's events. End of session, unless you have a question. Ralph said nope. Say said, then I bid you a fond good evening. Ralph said good night, says thank you.